I'm Sonia Luna, CEO and founder of Aviva Spectrum, an internal audit and compliance consulting firm headquartered in sunny Los Angeles, California. I'm also a well-known speaker on topics like COSO 2013, SOX 404, quality assessment reviews, internal auditing, and related topics. Today's interview I'm very excited about is with Norman Marks. Norman is a CPA, CRMA, and is the internationally branded evangelist for a better run business. Norman was the chief audit executive of major global corporations for 20 years and ran the SOX 404 programs and investigation units at several companies. His new book, called Management's Guide to Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404, Maximizing Value Within Your Organization, has been described by readers as the best, and I'm quoting here, the best SOX 404 guide for management, unquote, and can be purchased from the IIA website or on the wonderful website of Amazon.com. Welcome, Norman.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Sonia. It's good to be with you.
What was the inspiration for you to write your book, Management's Guide to Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404, especially now?
Thank you, Sonia. So this is actually an old book which has been significantly updated and given a new cover, and I think has got some great new value in it. The initial book came out a few years ago. I was on the international committee responsible at the IIA for developing the practice guides and practice advisories we all use to help us in our practice of internal auditing. And we as a committee looked around and we saw all of this guidance coming out on SOX from the CPA firms, from Protiviti, from consultants, experts, but not the people within the business who are charged with doing it. And we looked around at ourselves and said, we are the people who have the best understanding within our business of internal controls, how to assess the effectiveness of internal control, especially around financial reporting, because most of us had spent quite a few years in the auditing profession. Myself, I was with Cooper & Lybrand, PwC, for 10 years plus. And so we put together a team of very seasoned, experienced practitioners at CAE level for the most part, which I led. And I, with their help, wrote this book. We spent a lot of time talking to the regulators at the SEC and PCAOB, multiple meetings, and they were extraordinarily supportive and provided a lot of information on the background of their thinking, the fundamentals, and so on. And so we came out with the first edition of the book, which was initially a download from the IIA, and there was probably something like 200,000 copies that were downloaded. Since then, it's gone through multiple revisions, and we've come out at the end of last year with a major new update in hard copy and in soft copy. The updates over the year has obviously included updating it for auditing standard number 5, and then most recently to bring in the discussion of COSO 2013, the principles and how, especially given that we have to follow a recognized internal control framework, and the only one that's specifically recognized is COSO, how do we use that and still maintain a top-down risk-based approach to developing the scope of 404? And so we spent a lot of time, probably a 20% increase in the content of the book, just focusing on providing some guidance on COSO 2013.
Yeah, I personally found so Bush signed the SOX law into 2002. 2004 hit, and like you said, the big CPA firms, they were able to, because of their resources, quite frankly, create materials that were produced for their own benefit, which is, some would argue, overkill, because in the marketplace back in 2004 and 5, I were seeing astronomical fees. People were saying, we're over-auditing, this isn't really material, and or it's not the biggest risk in the organization, and you're correct. The internal audit group knows best not only how the company runs, but what the true risks are. An external auditor is there, quarterly for a review process at best, and then an annual audit. And so they're really always, months, sometimes years behind in really understanding what the true risks of a company are, because they're only there periodically. An internal audit group is living and breathing that organization's risks as well as their operations and those mitigating controls. And so this guidance not only is more relevant, I would say, than something that came from a Big Four branded firm. And you also have to think of the mindset. When I was working at Ernst & Young, I worked at two of the Big Four. We were just so coverage was the biggest thing in 2004 and 5. How much were we covering of the balance sheet and income statement? Therefore, the regulators, if they were to look at our work papers, would say, well, geez, we just beat the heck out of the balance sheet and income statement. There was no significant rock that was not lifted up and reviewed. You follow? So that's where the pendulum now has finally swung with your book, which is getting to where management can actually maximize the value of their compliance program rather than just meet the compliance regulation, which is more towards ticking and tying, let's say, key template risks that a Big Four firm may have that's going to audit you. And I wanted to cover something that you touched upon in the first question, which is COSO's new framework. I mean, it took over 20 years to build on, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that new framework. Do you think this is just going to be a simple mapping exercise that, a lot of practitioners are just going to look at it and map through it, or is this something that people really need to revisit the principles and the approaches that need to be implemented for their organization, and then taking more time to do this rather than just a simple mapping exercise? I wanted to get your thoughts about transitioning and how people should really absorb this new framework.
Thank you, Sonia. As you were talking, I was reminded of a comment that was made by CFO of one of my companies. He told the audit committee that, and this was after the external auditors had left, that we purchased an opinion from the external auditors. But if you really want to know what's happening within the organization, ask internal audit. And the book is in response to a lot of that overkill. The major focus of the book, the greatest benefit, I think, is it helps you develop a more efficient SOX program, and I think we'll come back to that. But the thing with COSO, I think people have become so focused on the principles that they've lost sight of a number of things. I was still a CIE in 1992 when the original framework came out, and I thought that for internal audit, it really didn't say anything new, but for many people, it was a tremendously valuable production because it brought everybody around the same common definition of what is internal control. And I think one of the most important things about the 2013 update is that it hasn't changed that definition of internal control. Mm-hmm. The other thing which is very important about looking at 2013 is that it remains risk-based. This is why you have that component in there, which is the risk assessment component. And people have gone to the major change, which is the addition of principles, and forgotten that the underlying, if you like, principle of COSO, which is internal control, is intended to reduce the level of likelihood of something going significantly wrong down to an acceptable level. It's always been risk-based, and it continues to be risk-based. What's happened is that PwC, who are the leaders of the task force, working with COSO, have provided some additional guidance and help. They've beefed up a lot of the content in COSO, which is some really excellent content in there. And they've added the principles. But if you look at the section there on what is effective internal control, it starts off with internal control has to reduce the level of risk to acceptable levels. And then it goes on to talk about the principles. So when people talk about mapping, that's fine. That's fine. It's really good to take the principles and say, what controls do I have, but how many controls do you need? That's the big question. How many controls do you need? And do you have too many? Do you have too few? The answer to that question has got to be based upon the level of risk. If you don't have independent, objective directors, what's the risk to your objectives? Is it something that could result in a material weakness or not? And it's the combination of satisfying the principles, which we have to do, but at the same time managing the risk at acceptable levels so that we don't have material weakness. That's the focus of the book, and that's what we're trying to do, is make sure we don't go overboard and start adding in a whole bunch of new controls or doing additional testing on existing controls. It's not necessary, because if that control failed, it wouldn't be material weakness. And even the regulators have talked about the SOX program as being, a quote, a search for material weaknesses. So we need to make sure that we're not doing things, we're not testing anything that if it failed would not be a material weakness, because that's a very strong indication we're doing too much work.